All About Relationships is an engaging, lighthearted, and practical show designed to help people improve their relationships in meaningful ways. Hosted by Dr. Don Allen, a certified Gottman therapist, as well as an advanced trainer for the Institute. He is also certified in emotion-focused therapy. With over 40 years of experience in the field of psychotherapy, Dr. Allen is here to provide expert guidance on strengthening marriages, parent-child relationships, friendships, and more. Through insightful discussions, audience call-ins, and guest experts, viewers receive real-world strategies to enhance intimacy, communication, and overall relationship satisfaction. So now, please welcome the host of All About Relationships, Dr. Don Allen.
And welcome back. This is All About Relationships, working towards ideal marriages and loving, lasting relationships. I'm Dr. Don Allen. I'm your host today, and I am happy to say we're into season 3 now. This is our second episode. And just a little bit about how I kind of work. I kind of have ideas come to me based on your comments and feedback and just kind of what I think we should be talking about. So last week, for my kickoff, I went with New Year's resolutions and New Year's resolutions for relationships, right? But what I did was I got a lot of feedback that they want more information on it. So I listened to you all. So as I put up my information that you can see, please give me feedback because I love to hear from you and I really do listen and shape my shows based on that. So today we're going to do New Year's resolutions for relationships, but it's going to be part 2. And I'm going to expound on what I talked about last week. Now, one of the things I like to do at the end of my show is to give us all something fun to go do with a relationship. Okay. And we did that last week. We talked about New Year's resolutions and how to talk to your partner about those and how to plan your year so that you can be successful about it. The other thing I talked about is, and this is just me, but generally speaking, over the last 40 years, if I make a New Year's resolution, I generally do it. I don't usually say, oh, shoot, I never got around to it. And there's a lot of reasons why that works. And there's a lot of reasons why folks, when they do New Year's resolutions, it doesn't work. So that's what I talked about last week. And I told people to go home and talk about it and make some plans. So if you didn't see last week's show or you're more interested in it, go back and watch last week's episode and then go ahead and do that with your partner. These should be fun, easy. These are good connectors for couples in relationships, and they are scientifically driven. What I do a lot of times, it dovetails very closely with the Gottman Institute and John and Julie's Gottman method. The other is I sometimes employ the emotion focus therapy a la Susan Johnson. So we're going to have fun with that. The other thing I will do, and I did this week, is I went ahead and I did a little more research on it that I kind of wanted to talk about. Now, remember, in my show, one of the things I try to do is think of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And what I mean by that is what works. We know from research that what worked 2,000 years ago, and it's probably going to work 2,000 years from now. Leo Tolstoy said, there's a million bad families, but there's only one good one. John and Julie says, there's a million bad relationships, but there's only one good relationship. And the great news is all we have to do is teach that one. And that's exactly what I do. The other thing too is it tends to be classic, meaning it probably is going to work, through the test of time. Think of songs that you really like or songs that have just been around forever. They're classics, but what they do is they really resonate with what really works in terms of writing a song and what we like. So to that end, we're going to look at what tends to work over time with relationships and New Year's resolutions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Okay. So what I want to do is to kind of get into some of the questions that, I thought of or I heard from last week's episode. Now, one of the things I mentioned last week is, healthy relationships like car maintenance don't require perfection, but they do require habits and attention to routine. And if you notice, 30 days is something, usually it becomes a habit. So it's just like physical fitness. The goal isn't intensity, it's practical consistency. It's doing it every day. When I used to be a runner, one of the things that I learned was the hardest part of running is the first 20 steps. Because if you can get out and do 20 steps, you'll probably do your exercise. But do we get out the door? Okay, so how do we do that? That's what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to talk about it as it applies to relationships. So, some of the questions that I want to throw out just to get us going. First one is, what happens inside you when your New Year's resolutions start to slip? What do you tell yourself at that moment in time? We're going to talk a lot about that today, right? So, the difference between thoughts and thinking, we're going to talk about that. Question two, have you ever noticed that most people don't quit their resolutions suddenly? They just quietly disengage, they look up, and guess what? They're not doing it. And then, so what if the biggest threat to your relationship goals isn't conflict, but discouraging self talk, right? So, something happens, the meaning we give it and what we do about it. Well, we're going to talk about that concept. What we're going to talk about, the difference between having thoughts and starting to think about those thoughts. That's where we want to have some fun. I know in the AA community, they talk about stinking thinking. What gets us back to relapse, that kind of thing. So we need to talk about what goes on in our mind as a process that really disconnects us from what we really want to do. Now, part of what I'm going to talk about with that too is that it's not just what we want to do, but our own happiness. How does this thinking drift us away from our happiness and what we really want in life? Right? Because a lot of times, if we're doing things or we're chasing things, they really don't make us happy. Like, boy, if I had $1 million. Well, okay, let's say I had $1 million. What does that do? Well, it's the meaning of the $1 million that we want to explore, not just having money for its own sake, right? So we'll talk about that today. How many of us sabotage our resolutions through overthinking? So that's what we're going to talk about. So welcome to my show, all about relationships. Remember, throughout my whole show, it's safety first, and this is education, not psychotherapy, right? So, like I said, one of my goals is to think: was it true 2,000 years ago, and will it probably be true 2,000 years from now? So that's what we're going to kind of look at. All right. All right. My overall belief system is that people are resilient and they can find ways through adversity if they have the right path and the right tools. I really believe in people. Okay. Well, last year in season 2, I had mentioned that I was just driving home from work and I saw a bumper sticker that says, "Don't believe everything you think." And I thought at that time, man, that sounds like something to kind of maybe address political ideas. People get very polarized on politics these days, and I thought maybe that's what that was. But you know what? I wanted to kind of know more about it, so I did look up the resource for that. And what I discovered was a book that was written by a person named Joseph Nguyen, and I'm going to spell his last name Nguren. And if you go to Amazon, you can usually find these kind of things. But his book was called "Don't Believe Everything You Think." Now listen to this: why your thinking is the beginning and the end of suffering or beyond suffering, right? So I was very intrigued by that. So what I did was, between last episode and this one, is I went ahead and read the book. And I really liked it. And one of the reasons I like it is it dovetails nicely into how I happen to think, right? So it makes it easier for me to convey to you. But I can also suggest you look at the book because it's an easy read and it really starts to talk about this idea that I'm talking about today. So I'm going to include some of the stuff he has. Of course, I'm going to dovetail it with the Gottman Institute stuff because it does dovetail nicely. And then a long time ago, because by background, I'm very steeped in what we call ego dynamic or psychodynamic modalities. When I was, very young in the field, I really studied Freud and all that kind of stuff. So I really like it. And there was a woman named Nora Gold in 1980, I think it was, and she wrote a paper on internal locus of control as it pertained to that theory. But you know what? I think it's a classic. I think it worked 2,000 years ago, and it's probably going to work 2,000 years from now. So those 3 concepts I'm going to share with you. A lot of times I'll give my opinions through experience, but I really like to ground everything we talk about in science because we know if it's scientific like that, it's going to probably work. Okay. So I don't believe everything in the book, but I will say that if I sat down with Joseph, my sense of it is some of the things that I'm puzzled about, I wouldn't be anymore because he would explain what he meant by that. I'm not going to get in totally to that book, but like I said, in the main, it's worth bringing up to all of you. Okay. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. One of the things I'm going to do a little bit early because I'm going to take time in the next episode or the next section is I'm going to talk a little bit about questions from the mailbag because these questions are going to actually springboard me into some good news that you all can access and utilize, right? So the first one from the mailbag says, "Dear Dr. Don, I really wanted to follow through with our relationship goals this week, but once life got busy, I fell back to my old habits and I didn't do it. Why does that happen?" Okay. So the next question, as my partner says, I overthink everything, but I feel like I'm just being realistic. How do I tell the difference with that? So perception versus interpretation, right? And then the third one is we set goals together. Thank you, by the way, because that's what I ask you all to do. But now it feels awkward to bring them up. How do we restart without creating tension? Well, remember, one of the things I'll mention with the Gottman stuff is gentle startup. Don't fall into the criticism kind of modes or what you don't like. Start with, gentle complaining and what you want and maybe even what you feel. So those kind of things can really help bring on the emotional safety that you all need to really do what we're talking about, right? And then the next one, and this is the last one I'll do today, is part of me thinks this never lasts anyway. So why do I bother doing it? Right? Well, that's part of what we're going to talk about today. So in Joseph's book that I just mentioned, his book, Don't Believe Everything You Think, one of the things that he talks about that I think are really, really important for us is that um, he will start with the idea of what is a thought. Okay. So let's say I'm playing chess. All right. Well, if I move my queen here, they're probably going to move their bishop up here, which means I'm going to have to move my pawn. And then they're going to probably move their knight. That's thinking in ways of what are the thoughts that I need to do. Okay. So let me go to another one. Let's say I want to join a health club. All right. So one of the things I might say is, hey, my New Year's resolution is to really get in better shape. And, one of the things I could do is join a health club. And if I joined a health club, I could do all these cool things to make my body strong. And that would be great. That's a thought. But now let me do some thinking for you. Well, I'm 67 years old, and if I go to a gym, everybody's going to be like 30, and they're all going to be in great shape, and they're all going to have those, 30-year-old bodies, and I'm going to bring my old 60-year-old body in here. And, they're going to probably look at me and say, man, what's that old guy doing here? And you know what else? People are going to probably look, and I don't really dress for fashion anymore. So, here I am with my white socks that I used to wear from the 1900s or the 1800s, whenever I was a kid. I can't remember now. And the next thing you know is they're going to look at me and say, boy, he's not hip. He's not happening. Or maybe they'll look at me and say, gosh, that guy doesn't have any hair. Oh my gosh. Now, if any of you didn't happen to notice I don't have hair, yeah, I'm afraid it's true. Okay. So let's say I start doing all of what I just did. That's thinking. But you notice how thinking starts to get me away from just my thoughts. What are my thoughts? You know what? I would feel better if I got in better shape. And it would probably be better for my health if I got into better shape. And what are the best ways to get into better shape? Well, I could walk. I could join a gym. I could find a place to swim. I could maybe bike. Those are all thoughts. They have nothing to do with what happens if. But the minute I get to what happens if, right? The minute I get into that, then I start to get into that thinking that short circuits what I'm going to do. And what's under that are feelings that are generated. So we're going to break to commercial. And when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about how we drift out of connection and doing with this kind of thinking. Talk to you soon.
Mike Zorek, a three-time California state champion in Greco-Roman wrestling at 114 pounds. Mike, blind since birth, was born in Hartford, Connecticut.
He was a 6-time national placer, including 2 seconds, 2/3, and 2/4. He also won the Veterans Folk-Style Wrestling twice at 152 pounds. In all these tournaments, he was the only blind competitor. Nancy Zorick, a creative spirit whose talents have taken her to the stage and into galleries and exhibitions in several states. Her father, a commercial artist who shared his instruments with his daughter and helped her fine-tune her natural abilities, influenced her decision to follow in his footsteps. Ms. Zorick has enjoyed a fruitful career doing what she loves. Listen Saturday mornings at 12 Eastern for the Nancy and Mike Show for heartwarming stories and interesting talk.
Are you struggling to care for elderly parents or a spouse? Do you wonder if being a caregiver is making you sick? Are you worried about taking time off work to care for elderly parents and balance work, life, and caregiving? Has caregiving become exhausting and emotionally draining? Are you an aging adult who wants to remain independent, but you're not sure how? I'm Pamela D. Wilson. Join me for the Caring Generation radio show for caregivers and aging adults, Wednesday evenings, 6 Pacific, 7 Mountain, 8 Central, and 9 Eastern, where I answer these questions and share tips for managing stress, family relationships, health, well-being, and more. Podcasts and transcripts of the Caring Generation are on my website, PamelaDWilson.com, plus my caregiving library, online caregiver support programs, and programs for corporations interested in supporting working caregivers. Help, hope, and support for caregivers is here on the Caring Generation and PamelaDWilson.com.
All right, we are back, and we are going to be talking a little bit more about what sabotages our New Year's resolutions. I'm Dr. Don Allen. This is all about relationships, working towards ideal marriage and loving, lasting relationships. We just started talking about the difference between thoughts and thinking, and I would argue overthinking. Now, one of the things I do want to mention with that is this is really kind of the center of Joseph's book, Don't Believe Everything You Think, because what he talks about is that you have the power through your thought to not act on the thinking that starts to happen that sabotages you. The other thing too is that you can have thinking that encourages more productive thought. But at the end of the day, once we've thought enough, we want to engage our goals, right? So let's look at corporations. You know, they have missions, they have objectives, and they have goals. So if your mission this year is to have a closer relationship with your partner and to engage in activities like 3-day weekends or Friday night date night or State of the Union meetings, these are all great New Year's resolutions. They dovetail very nicely into the Gottman method and the crucial 6 hours a week for maintaining a good relationship. And that's a lot of thoughts. How are we going to get together for an hour and talk about how our relationship is? How are we going to get together for just 20 minutes a day and take 10 minutes each and talk about how our day was? These are thoughts, what to do, right? Now, thinking might be, well, if we get together, I know it's going to end in an argument because it always does. And, you know, I'll say this and then they'll say that. And then I'll get really mad. And then I'll say this and they'll get really mad. You hear how the thinking not only drifts, but listen to the energy in my voice. I started talking quicker and I started talking with more intensity. And what's behind that? Okay. Well, what often happens is the fear of the unknown. What might go wrong is the fear of the unknown. And Joseph talks a lot in his book about how we need to stop and look at feelings and just have them, to just sit with them. Now, again, a lot of what he talks about dovetails with a lot of hard science that really works. You know, I'll give you an example. There was a guy by the name of, what was his name? Might have been Wilson, back in the 50s. It'll come to me. But anyway, he came up with this expression of shoulds, must, and other irrational beliefs. And that was in the 50s. You know, a person who actually my mother really, really liked would talk about your not erroneous zones, but your erogenous zones. And he talked about just thinking that really short circuited your ability to kind of do things. His name was Dr. Wayne Dyer, and I'm sorry to say we lost him a couple years ago. I actually went on a weekend retreat to learn how to write books, and he sponsored it. And I got to meet him, and he was fascinating. And I really liked his books, and I really told him in person that I really appreciated him because I know my mother really felt better because she read his books and again started changing her thinking and moving towards thought. So a lot of this stuff, it's not necessarily new, but like I said, I like Joseph's way of doing it because it tends to say, look, if you do it this way, it's probably going to last you a lifetime. It's probably going to work. So, like I said, shout out to his book. One of the things, for example, in this is that like thoughts are not truths. And what that means is, according to Joseph, is thoughts are transient mental events, not objective facts. So what he means by that is suffering will increase when we mistake thoughts for reality. I'm going to go to the gym and everybody's going to make fun of me. That's not reality. My experience overwhelmingly is when I go to the gym, I kind of like to be invisible and people are into their own routines. They're not into me. And that's just kind of the way I see it. So that's a thought. It's not the other. But if everybody were into that, I just would ignore them. I really personally don't care about that. But some people do, right? Some people do. The Gottman would be, flooding and self-soothing research shows that when thinking are treated as facts. So in other words, I have a thought monster and now all of a sudden that thought monster becomes it's already happened or it's going to happen. So I know it's going to happen. Okay. Then what happens is your body starts freaking out. So physiological arousal, which is a fancy way to saying your body upregulates. And now you start making cortisol and adrenaline. That's fancy. But then all of a sudden you flood. Your thinking brain turns off and you go into reactive brain and try to get out of that emotional burning building. So hard to do when your thinking brain's turned off, right? So what happens is we start using defensiveness, criticism, and stonewalling or withdrawal. So that's where Gottman says, heads up with that, right? Now, Nora Gold, in her internal working model, would talk about, we tend to organize our expectations about the self and others. In other words, the more we live, the more we reinforce kind of our belief systems. And then all of a sudden, well, that's probably going to happen. And we kind of live our lives kind of thinking those things. So let's say one of my working models, it isn't, but let's say one of my working models is, you really can't trust people. I've lived a long time and I got to tell you that you really can't trust people. It's not true. I mean, I think there's kind of the bell curve in that. You can trust some, you can not trust others. But, like I said, I can kind of regulate, in talking to somebody where I kind of stand with that, right? So anyway, but, Nora says, we can become very rigid and lose our adaptation to people by reinforcing reality that probably isn't true. Another one, I like to put these down, sorry. Another one is awareness creates choice. Now let's look at it kind of the other way. And don't believe everything you think, right? What he would say is your freedom comes from noticing thoughts without immediately acting on them, right? So let's say I have a thought and all of a sudden all these worries come up, right? All these worries. Well, I can act on those, but I don't know that. So let's say I say, boy, I want to join a gym. But boy, it's too far to go drive and I'm going to have to get into traffic and it's going to take me 10 hours to exercise and I don't have that kind of time and stuff. I don't know that. But see, the thinking's already got me adrift. And what's behind the thinking? Well, the emotions. Do I have enough time? Do I really want to go and put my body through that? Well, now I'm imagining those things, right? Well, those feelings are being generated by worry, by fear of the unknown, by past experiences that may have demotivated me for that. Same way with relationships. Well, I can go ahead and try to walk with my partner every night, but you know what? I know it's going to be a fight. Now, remember the mailbag today, right? I just know that, we're going to get into that and we're going to start fighting. And boy, what's the use of? In Gottman land, that's called negative sentiment override or, assuming the negative of what's going to happen? It's thinking. That's where Joseph comes in to help us. It's thinking. Nora comes in to say we create these ways of thinking, and then we start to make that as our internal working template, right? So that's kind of something we probably shouldn't do. So the next one is, if we over identify with our thinking rather than just have thoughts and then come up with a plan, what tends to happen is that the pain intensifies and the thoughts we have become who we are, right? We don't want to do that. So we can't get to the point where, we start worrying about everything. And the next thing we know, we don't want to leave our house in the extreme, right? Well, my sense of it is that what's realistic, what's reasonable. Now, I always say safety first. But a lot of times we can talk to friends and neighbors and people we love and family, and we could come up with realistic ways to kind of push the envelope in a safe way and realistic way. All right. So, like I said, if my New Year's resolution is to run a marathon, I'm not going to go out tomorrow and run 26 miles. But what I might do is to do what I used to call, when I used to run, stretch runs. And that is, if I started running now, and I really can't, my knees are not such that I can, but if I did, let's say I could run, I'd probably go out and run a mile, and it would be really slow just to stretch my muscles. When I go to play tennis, the first, I don't know, week or so, I'm just moving my body. I'm not trying to do anything more than get the ball over the net, and hopefully the ball comes back to me, and just start to do that. And then when I start to feel overly taxed, I probably either take a break or I say, hey, that's enough for today. But if I start to think of all the things that can go wrong, or I go gung ho and I start to play 2 sets of tennis, probably going to injure myself, right? So that's a thought, but it's realistic, But the imagining of all these things, so I never get out the door, probably isn't good. That's where, like I mentioned with Gottman, it's the negative sentiment override. We begin to believe the negative and start to lead with that's the fact. And, we don't know that. We really don't. And we don't have to get into all of the things that might go wrong, but we certainly, when those come up, want to slow down and deal with our feelings. Feelings usually happen, they rise, and then if you just sit with them long enough, they fall back, right? They fall back to it. One of the things that John and Julie Gottman talk about is we can get into a thing where when we start to argue, we just go negative and can't get unnegative. And that's what he says, is that, you step into a quicksand bog of negativity in which escape is hopeless and you just stay into the negative. Well, one of the things, as the metaphor, because when John said that, one of the things I thought of when I watched those old movies when I was a kid and they had quicksand, I haven't seen one in about 30 years. But what happens is you fall into quicksand. Apparently, I don't know this, but apparently the best thing to do is not move, because if you don't move, the air in your body and just your natural buoyancy will keep you on the surface. But if you fight and you struggle, well, that's when you sink into the quicksand. Well, the same thing happens if we get into an argument with our partner and we're into that quicksand bog of negativity. First thing you want to do is stop having all of that negative and stop arguing in a way that you see your partner as negative, right? So with New Year's resolutions, it's the same thing. Hey, I really would like to walk with my partner for 20 minutes a night, just 20 minutes. Well, what's going to happen is, well, that's thinking. So it's like, hey, I think I'll go to my partner and say, hey, we're in a new year. I really want to exercise, but I really want to exercise with you. And I think it's awesome that we walk together, because when we walk together, I love how we talk and I just love being with you. I would love it if you would consider walking with me. Okay, it's a different way of asking, isn't it? So that's what I'm saying, the positivity. Okay. So what Joseph says with his book, Don't Believe Everything You Think, he says you don't need to eliminate negative thoughts, just stop obeying them, and instead, don't fuel the negative thinking. So just something to keep in mind. Gottman always talks about behavioral change precedes emotional change. So what we want to do is turn towards trust, and then that builds, the positive sentiment so that we can do it. Nora Gold talks about corrective emotional experiences will update the internal working model. What that means is that, hey, you know what? I thought all these terrible things about going to the gym, but I've been going to the gym for 6 weeks now, and it's actually kind of fun. And you know what? I feel better. And I really focus on not what I think, but I feel better, and I feel like I've accomplished something. And while I was there, I say hi to some of the people that are regulars and don't do much more than that, but it kind of makes me feel like we're kind of doing it all together. So I didn't think that would happen. But you know what? I like the thinking about the positive thoughts that I'm having now. So we can correct that, right? So let me look at my time. We are probably ready to go to our next commercial, and then we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about this. And believe it or not, we're going to go into that fourth segment where we're going to have some fun with an exercise again. We'll see you shortly.
Master of words, powerful player. What life-changing words can Dr. Janet Smith Warfield pull out of her magical toolbox that just might mysteriously open a door you never knew was there? A door to free yourself from fear forever. Transform your rage into right action. Release your guilt. Position you into a life of freedom, purpose, passion, power, and peace. All quite suddenly, unexpectedly, and almost miraculously, with no effort on your part. Join Dr. Janet on Dancing with Words, Dancing with Wisdom, as she and her guests show you how words map our experiences, immersing you in a sound bath that relaxes your muscles, opens your mind, and supports you in co-creating your extraordinary life. Author, radio show host, and coach John M. Hawkins reveals strategies to help gain perspective, build confidence, find clarity, achieve goals. John M. Hawkins' new book, Coached to Greatness: Unlock Your Full Potential with Limitless Growth, published by iUniverse. Hawkins reveals strategies to help readers accomplish more. He believes the book can coach them to greatness. Hawkins says that the best athletes get to the top of their sport with the help of coaches, mentors, and others. He shares guidance that helps readers reflect on what motivates them, rediscover and assess their core values, philosophies, and competencies, find settings that allow them to be the most productive, and track their progress towards accomplishing goals.
And we're back. I'm Dr. Don Allen. This is all about relationships. So, what we're going to do is continue to talk about what sabotages our New Year's resolutions, but we're also going to extend that to making new goals and resolutions for our partner so that we really set the stage for a solid relationship this year and friendship. You notice how I'm kind of doing this right before Valentine's Day because, a lot of times people kind of build up for Valentine's Day because they want to make it special. So by doing this now, you'll really have an opportunity to celebrate Valentine's Day in a way that's much more positive because it won't be about chocolate and flowers. It'll be more about, gee, I really like you and I can't wait to spend time with you. And, those bids for connection, that 20 minutes to 1 minute positive to negative really starts to build deposits in that relationship bank. And then even if you do have some conflict, you want to get back to being buddies because of all of the positive energy that you've created. And that's what we're doing today. We're really looking at how our thinking can start to get in the way of our friendships and relationships. One of the things I mentioned last season was I talked about that 24 predictable step into catastrophe. Because we do know from science that, a lot of times when relationships don't make it, they follow this fairly predictive 24-step pattern. And if you notice, when you look at that and compare it to what I'm talking about today, you can really see how that thinking really starts to race and that negativity really starts to take center stage. And then the bad habits start to happen. And then we start to think and think and think. And then our thinking goes to all of these negatives. And the exact opposite of what I'm telling you right now starts to happen. So the next one I want to talk about is feelings follow belief, not events. What does that mean? Feelings follow belief and not events. Well, what happens is we might have an event. I think I'll go to the gym, right? But my feelings about, well, how is that going to be when I go to the gym? How are people going to see me? And boy, I'm going to spend that money and then not go to the gym, and then I'm going to spend all that money for nothing. And all of these beliefs are beginning to shape what we do next, when in reality, the event of going to the gym is really a thought. Do I go or do I not go? If I do go, what do I want to get out of it? Right? Well, that's your mission, right? The objectives will be, setting a plan about how you're going to exercise at the gym. And then the last one are the goals. I think I'm going to follow this, right? So if I were to go to the gym, actually, I have an advantage because I used to go to the gym all the time and I used to know exactly what I was going to do. I had it in my head and I followed my plan. And then I measured my goals once a week, right? The other thing I don't know whether this is true anymore, but I used to hate going to the gym at the beginning of the year because it was packed. And I like to go to the gym. I like to do my stuff. I don't like a lot of people there. I don't like to have to wait for machines. I hate it when people don't clean off their machines and I have to clean them off for them. And just a lot of stuff like that. It's packed. But just about a week or two after Valentine's Day, there was nobody at the gym. So what I'm telling you is I noticed their New Year's resolutions seem to me, at least, it's not scientific, but seem to me to fall off around after Valentine's Day. So when I started, going to the gym, it was like, oh, good, we're finally in the middle of February. I have my machines to myself. So feelings follow beliefs, not events. So what we want to do is we want to think about events, right? So what happens with Joseph in his book is emotional suffering is created by interpretation of events, not the events themselves. Well, that's what I just said, right? So we interpret what might happen, and if we do it enough or we get anxious enough, we start believing it's true, even though we haven't checked it out. Gottman support. Perception mediates conflict. So what he says there, that's a fancy way of saying it, is our perceptions start to interfere or help our conflict. Emotional coaching separates feelings from distorted interpretations. So something that I say all the time in my practice is say it like this: when this happened, it made me feel this. What I need from you instead, if you don't mind, is this. So what you've actually accomplished is talk about the event, how it made you feel, and what you would like instead. Say what you want, not what you don't want. Say what you feel, not what you don't feel. Right? Nora Gold, in her internal working model, is emotional responses arrive from expectancy templates. I love how people can make things sound so much busier than they need to be. So what that means is our emotional response arise from just over and over time reinforcing what we expect to happen, right? I'm going to go out, I'm going to try to run, I'm going to stop running, and then I'm going to give up. Okay, well, do you hear it? My response of exasperation, just give up. The feeling of, arises from what I expect is going to happen because of the past. Now, I will say, in fairness to that what we have sometimes is that prior behavior, is kind of what we can expect from future behavior, right? In other words, if I've never exercised, that's precedent. But that doesn't mean that you can't just be starting off in a foundational way and build slowly, right? Pick one thing and do one thing and see how you're doing. If you're going to pick two things, separate them out and then concentrate on them individually rather than try to do too many things, especially if it's a toughie for you, right? Right. So what I like about Nora Gold with her internal working model is when control-based models shift. I'm sorry, I have fun with this. What happens is if you move towards or from old thinking towards new thinking and you feel better and you're happier, what happens is you're moving towards a trust-based way of thinking versus a control-based. I've got to do everything. I've got to control it. Remember, people control on the outside, when they don't feel in control on the inside. So, we start to go to trust base, safety and regulation increased, and then we move from control to spontaneous. What do you want to do today? I don't know. What do you want to do? Hey, how about we go on a walk? Yeah, that sounds good. Why don't we go? Spontaneous, right? Spontaneous. Control based. Well, what am I going to wear? What's the temperature? Well, what if I pull a muscle when I go? Well, and you listen to my voice and how much energy starts to come out, right? So that's an example of control base. What Nora's talking about is control base. But once we get to a trust base and we start developing our internal way of thinking in a trust way, in a realistic way, we built the trust, right? Then we can say, wait a minute, we don't have to worry about that so much. Okay. So in other words, what she says is the internal locus of control, meaning that inside of ourselves, we feel like we can do it. So if I say to myself, I think I'm going to go to the gym and I'm going to work for 12 weeks and I'm going to build this model and I have a plan, I believe inside I can do it. I have control over making that happen. So once we develop more along the lines of that, this begins to be our new precedent. Okay, right? So what Joseph says with don't believe everything you think is control is regained by changing one's relationship to thought and back to, the thought and the thinking and the emotions around that, so that the negative thinking or the thinking that gets in our way stops happening, so we stop suffering. That's kind of what I think he would say to that. Okay. Gottman is responsibility without blame. That's the antidote, by the way, to defensiveness, is take responsibility rather than defend where we are. Responsibility without blame strengthens our trust and self-soothing capacities, and we're much more able to accept influence from our partner. Now, influence from our partner, just to remind you, doesn't mean you have to listen to everything they say. What it really is it really matters to me what you say, and I really want to listen to it, and I really want to see how your world is based on what you're saying. So it's accepting how they are talking in a way that it can help us and influence both of us in a positive way. Okay. So what happens is with Nora, if you do it right, I'm not even going to give you the fancy. If you do it right, it supports self-reflection, emotional regulation, and then being able to be flexible in relationships, spontaneity. See, a lot of this stuff, it's really a lot of different words, but the same thing. Well, why is that, Don? Because what works 2,000 years ago probably is going to work 2,000 years from now, and it works today. And that's why the whole basis of my show, when Bold Brave Television and Radio came to me and said, Don, we really want you to create a program. And I looked at my missions, objectives, and goals. One of the things I said is, what works? What works for people? And then I say, why don't people do it? Because we're not taught this. As a matter of fact, a lot of what we see in the media and on the news and in commercials and stuff want to keep you buying things because of your insecurity. Well, I really feel insecure because I don't have hair. So you know what? I'm going to wear a shirt, and this shirt's going to help me compensate for the fact I don't have hair. I don't know. This shirt kind of keeps me warm. I like it. Actually, I have a coat on today just because it's really going to be cold in Texas. Believe it or not, in Texas this weekend, we maybe are going to have an ice storm. So I'm kind of embracing that because I grew up in places like New York City and Ohio, and it gets really cold. So I'm kind of enjoying the cold for a couple of weeks. It's kind of nice. So I'm kind of getting into it, but get my coat out, enjoy it for the moment. Right. So that's kind of what I mean. Why am I wearing a coat? Why am I wearing a shirt? Those kind of things are nothing. They're just thoughts. I think I'll wear a shirt today. I think I'll wear a coat. However, if I'm wearing a shirt to impress you, or I'm wearing a coat because, I think it's fashionable, well, then I'm doing it for the wrong reasons. That's thinking. But if I want to look good because I care about you all and I like you and I want you to see me in a good light, those are positive reasons to connect with somebody. And that kind of thinking is actually positive for all of us, right? All of us. So, you've got to look at that. That's what I said earlier on the show. I want to make $1 million. Well, okay. But the real question is, why do I want to make $1 million? Actually, Joseph talks about this in his book too, right? Do I want to make $1 million to impress everybody? Do I want to make $1 million so that I can, buy a Lamborghini? Do I want to make $1 million just for financial security and to have things so that I can, make sure I provide for my family and have enough for when I retire? Those are all reasons to have $1 million. But, again, what are we chasing? And that's where people, when you really start to look into addiction theory, and I used to specialize in treating drug alcohol. In fact, I worked at drug alcohol hospitals. I taught it at universities. And, when you begin to look at addiction models and why people get out of control with some of that stuff, some of that stuff for many people is tied to this idea of, feeling security through, maybe narcotizing with alcohol or something. But there's a lot of reasons why people might drink. And some of them are good and some of them aren't good. And some people believe drinking, period, isn't good for your health. So there's a lot of ways to think about it, but it's the thinking of it and what drives our behavior that I'm talking about today. Okay. So, and that's what I'm saying. People can call me up and say, hey, Don, would you do a show on addiction and relationships? Yeah, I can do it. But let me know what you want, because I'm kind of guiding myself right now into Valentine's Day. And Valentine's Day, I'm actually going to talk about what goes into good sex. So that's going to be kind of fun. I want to give you a preview of coming attractions, but we're going to do that. So I tell you what, I think we're going to take a break and we're going to go right to that part of our show where we all go out and have fun doing something based on all of this cool stuff. We'll see you in a second.
Are you struggling to care for elderly parents or a spouse? Do you wonder if being a caregiver is making you sick? Are you worried about taking time off work to care for elderly parents and balance work, life, and caregiving? Has caregiving become exhausting and emotionally draining? Are you an aging adult who wants to remain independent, but you're not sure how? I'm Pamela D. Wilson. Join me for the Caring Generation radio show for caregivers and aging adults, Wednesday evenings, 6 Pacific, 7 Mountain, 8 Central, and 9 Eastern, where I answer these questions and share tips for managing stress, family relationships, health, well-being, and more. Podcasts and transcripts of The Caring Generation are on my website, PamelaDWilson.com, plus my caregiving library, online caregiver support programs, and programs for corporations interested in supporting working caregivers. Help, hope, and support for caregivers is here on The Caring Generation and PamelaDWilson.com.
Master of words, powerful player. What life-changing words can Dr. Janet Smith Warfield pull out of her magical toolbox that just might mysteriously open a door you never knew was there? A door to free yourself from fear forever. Transform your rage into right action. Release your guilt. Position you into a life of freedom, purpose, passion, power, and peace. All quite suddenly, unexpectedly, and almost miraculously, with no effort on your part. Join Dr. Janet on Dancing with Words, Dancing with Wisdom, as she and her guests show you how words map our experiences, immersing you in a sound bath that relaxes your muscles, opens your mind, and supports you in co-creating your extraordinary life.
All right, here we are into that section 4 where we're going to come up with something fun to do. Now, one thing I invite you to do is go back and watch last week's episode, because some of the stuff really bases itself on that and we can build from it. But today I want to do, for our fun thing, is what I call the 7-minute reset conversation. Now, I want you guys to be talking like 10 minutes each, just how's your day? And that's one of the resolutions I invite you to think about. But this is a 7-minute reset for our New Year's resolution. So do this in this order. First, individual reflection. Take a minute or so, or come to the meeting with an idea of what your resolutions are and how they went this week. So each partner silently look at that. Number 2, what were my goals for last week? What got in my way of doing them this week? Say it so you're not doing thinking. No blame, no excuses, just facts. What got in my way? Just thoughts, no thinking. Next, gently for 2 minutes each, take turns sharing what you're coming up with each other. So one thing you might start with is one thing I noticed about myself was, and then you didn't fix it, you didn't defend it. One of the things I was going to do is go over and see about joining a gym. I never got around to doing it. I never put it on my schedule. I looked up, it was Friday, and I didn't do anything with it. So those are just thoughts. They aren't why I didn't do it, right? And then your partner does the same thing. So now you know theirs, they know yours. And then what is one small thing I want to try to do different this week? Okay, so let's say the resolution for your couple was we were going to walk this week and we didn't. So what you do is you sit down and you say, the one thing I'm going to do is sit down and we're going to synchronize our schedules. So each day we're going to walk for 20 minutes. Now, let's say Tuesday, there's no way we can do it. Let's say Wednesday we can do it, but we got to go an hour later. Write it down in the book together. One small thing. Now, let's say there's 2 or 3. Just deal with one at a time. Okay? Just deal with one at a time. And then go back and talk about how much better you felt after you did it. Hey, I really enjoyed the walk. Well, what did you like about it? Start talking about the positive emotional gain that you've gotten from it, right? And that'll really help. Now, a couple things, if I have time, yeah, I do. A couple things I want to talk about is that these are some of the things that can really help this. I mentioned the 10-minute daily check-in, okay? And then this one's a 7-minute, rewind for the resolutions. So what you want to do is give one daily appreciation together. One thing I really appreciated about you this week was this, or today, one of the things I noticed I just really liked about you is this. Remember, unconditional love, right? Not conditional. Then, one time we might want to make it so we have a walk or a State of the Union meeting. State of the Union meetings I like for an hour. Start out with 5 things that really went well, 5 things that you really liked about your partner, and then go ahead and talk about what went well this week, what didn't, and then make plans for next week. Okay? Try to do at least one repair each week. We step on each other's toes. We're not very efficient as humans at communicating. So when we've had regrettable incidences, that's when you take responsibility, which is the antidote for defensiveness, and just talk about how you could have done better. And then your partner says, well, you know what? Where I could have done better was this. And then you slap 5 and you make some goals so that things get better, understanding that you're probably going to mess up on something else next week. We don't avoid these, we expect them. We just do. So what we want to do is repair them. I'm sorry, I didn't do that well. One of the things that you can do in the morning is set your day to where you have like a half an hour of quiet time, even if it means getting up a little early. Just have your coffee and just reflect on the day and just, look at that. At bedtime, start to slow down, settle down, do things, to help you fall asleep well, right? The other thing, when you commute, you can give before you leave work an appreciation text to your partner about, hey, I'm coming home and I can't wait to see you. How long does that take? 15 seconds? So just little things you do before you start driving. And then at dinner, you'll talk about what your highlight in the day was. What was really went well today, but also what you really appreciated about your partner. I'm Dr. Don Allen. This is all about relationships, working towards ideal marriage and loving lasting relationships. Thank you for joining me today. Remember, safety first. I look forward to seeing you next week, 1:00 Eastern time, and we're going to continue to talk about exciting ways of having a better relationship. Thank you for joining me. We'll see you then.
While All About Relationships is educational and entertaining, it is not a substitute for therapy, counseling, or professional advice, but an informative space for learning and growth. So tune in each week for an engaging and reliable approach to your relationships, ensuring viewers with practical tools to create deeper connections in their daily lives. Whether tackling conflict resolution, emotional intimacy, or family dynamics, this show is your go-to resource for anyone looking to foster healthier, happier relationships in a supportive and lighthearted environment. Every Wednesday, 1 p.m. Eastern.